My name is Adam Blackwell, the Vice President International at Development Services Group, and on behalf of the entire team, the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, that are known as GTAC. I will try and moderate this session. For those of you who don't know GTAC, was created by GSG and our partners at George Mason University, led by Dr. Louise Shelley, to support our contract with the Department of State to develop a database of global terrorism incidents, to prepare the annual annex of statistical information on terrorism, and to help prepare and edit the congressionally mandated country reports on terrorism. We do this with a combination of technology, data collection, and a team of well-trained, multilingual, and multicultural data analysts, many of whom are listening in today. And I would just like to give a shout out to our team who have done an exceptional job as we finish this mad dash to complete all of 2020 processing, which has been done in the most bizarre of circumstances in the world of COVID. I'm just absolutely amazed at how well we've been able to accommodate the work and keep going. As many of you know, we've tried to develop this concept of a speaker series to bring in eminent practitioners in the field of terrorism, just to make sure that we're getting a global perspective on the issues, and we're taking as holistic a view as possible. We like to do this using Zoom, so we can bring people in from wherever they may be. A couple of weeks ago, we had somebody from Nigeria, and next time it will be somebody from Kenya. To clarify that the views expressed here are those of the speaker, not necessarily DSG or the State Department. I'd like to introduce our colleague, Dr. Victor Asal, who we're very proud and pleased to have join us today, and very grateful. He is going to speak to us about non-state organizations and political violence, a quantitative perspective. Dr. Asal, from the University of Maryland in 2003, is the director of the Center of Policy Research and professor of political science at the University of Albany. He's affiliated with the National Consortia for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, START, at DHS Center of Excellence. His research focuses on non-state actor violence in the cases of political discrimination, particularly related to ethnicity and gender. He also researches nuclear crises, behavior, and pedagogy. Dr. Asal has been involved in research projects funded by Defense by DARPA, Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and the Department of Homeland Security, the National Science Foundation, and the Office of Naval Research and the Department of Homeland Security. Dr. Asal will speak for roughly 20 minutes, and I would ask everybody to prepare your questions as he is speaking and to put them in the Q&A function in Zoom so that we can start the questions as quickly as possible. Dr. Victor, over to you.
Great. So Adam, can you allow me to share my screen?
I can. How do I do? Can I do that, Justin? How do I do that?
You have to click on allow somebody else to access. You can make me a co-host.
How do I do that? Well, do you want to start, Victor, while we figure that out?
Justin, while you're figuring it out, just let me know. Okay, everybody. So my name is Victor Asal, as Adam mentioned. We're going to be talking about non-state organizations and political violence from a quantitative and analytical perspective. One thing I'd like to make clear before we start is if anybody's interested in any of my papers, and I'd be happy to send you any papers that you might be interested in. And I would also be happy to talk as well. I think I'm the only Victor Asal in the United States. So if you search me on Google, you will find me. Okay, I'm hoping everybody can now see the PowerPoints, and so we should be good there. And let's get started. So first, what we're going to talk about is why might organizations turn to violence in the first place? And to do this, I'm going to be talking about an analysis we did on ethnopolitical violence and nonviolence nonviolent contentious politics in the Middle East. And this is an analysis that I did with Richard Legault, Ora Sekeli, and Jonathan Wilkenfeld. And it's using the MAROB dataset, that's the Minorities at Risk Organizational Behavior dataset, based on the Minorities at Risk dataset that Ted Gurr collected. This focused specifically on minorities at risk in the Middle East from 1980 to 2004 yearly. And what it did was it went beyond groups, which is what Ted Gurr was focusing on, and looked at ethno-political organizations that claim to represent these groups. And one of the advantages of this data set is it's yearly, and it's both violent and non-violent organizations. A lot of times people collect data either on one or the other, and this collects data on groups, some of which are active in this, some of which are not, but they're comparable. The disadvantage is that we've only gotten resources to collect up till 2004. And so at this point, it's data that's about 16 years old, but we think the analytical perspective here is still useful. And violence and nonviolence can often be a problematic separation in the behavior of non-state actors. And most of the literature out there either looks at protest or looks at violence, but doesn't really look at both. And when it does, it often makes them hierarchical in the way that it looks at these questions. And I think of violence and protest as a menu of choice. And you can pick some from option A, some from option B, but you could also pick option C, which is none, or option D, which is let me have some violence and let me have some protest. And if we look, for example, at the PFLP in the West Bank and the PFLP in Lebanon, you can see that organizations go back and forth. So for example, the PFLP in the West Bank, 84 to 88, violent, 89 to 90, mixed, both violent and non-violent, 91, violence, 92, 93, both, 94, violence, 95, both, 96, violence. Some of you may be aware about why, but 97 to 2000, neither, and then 2001 to 2003, back to both, and then 2004, only one. And similar for the PFLP in Lebanon. So why would organizations choose violence versus nonviolence? There's some possible arguments that are out there in the literature, and you know, things that we were thinking of. One is opportunity structure, and by opportunity structure, we mean that what kind of country is an organization involved in? Is there the possibility for safe nonviolent contention? And what I mean by that is there the possibility of protesting without getting killed? And some places, if you're going to protest, you're very likely to get killed. Some places in the middle, and some places, no, you're protesting, they're not going to shoot you, even if sometimes those organizations are also engaged in violence. And then also active repression, how much repression from the state is having an impact on the costs of shutting down traditional politics or protest and moving organizations only in the direction of using violence. And so these are two key factors. Other possible factors that might be having an impact are diaspora support. Diaspora support can be tied to the possibility of organizations using violence, because the diaspora, so if I'm living in an occupied country and I try to use violence and support, give money to use violence, I'm going to suffer the costs of repression. But if I'm in the diaspora giving money to an organization and they're using violence, I'm not going to suffer the cost. So diaspora support could very well lead to supporting violent contention. If an organization is only domestically based and does not have external powers, like for example, the PFLP has organization, you know, part of the organization is in Lebanon and part of the organization is the West Bank. If it's only in one place, then there is an incentive for not using violence, because you could be targeted in a way that could be very painful. And then social services could also have an impact. If I'm providing social services, I'm basically challenging the position of the state. And by challenging the position of the state, that means I'm trying to challenge the state in a very serious fashion. So that could lead to mixed and violent strategies, especially given the kinds of organizations we're looking at. And in terms of ideologies, there's a very large literature and empirical literature that says that religious and leftist ideologies have been tied to violence. And a lot of that is qualitative, but some of it is quantitative as well. An ideology that has not been looked at very much in terms of its impact are gender ideologies. And by impact, I mean impact on violence. But there is literature that suggests that patriarchal attitudes and a gender exclusive ideology is likely to be connected more to violence-only strategies. And a gender inclusive ideology could very likely push organizations in exactly the opposite direction and make them less likely to use violent strategies. So our methodology here is to use what's called multinomial logit, because we're not ordering these. We're saying you can choose any of these. And we're looking at a time series analysis. And here are the results. And interestingly, what we're seeing here is that if you're in a democracy, you're 23% less likely to use violence, 8% more likely to go traditional, and 8% more likely to go nonviolent. If you are an organization that is only domestic, you're 20% more likely to go with traditional politics and 15% less likely to go with violence. And I think the logic there makes a lot of sense. Diaspora, which is, this is somewhat of a depressing finding, 52% less likely to use traditional politics, 2% more likely to use nonviolent politics, but 41% more likely to use violence if you're getting serious diaspora support. Following up on the gender inclusion and gender exclusion, what we're seeing here is organizations that are gender exclusive are 28% more likely to use violence, while organizations that are gender inclusive are 22% less likely to use violence. Gender exclusive organizations are 17% less likely to use traditional politics, while gender inclusive organizations are 10% more likely to use traditional and 13% more likely to use nonviolence. Religious ideology, and this is interesting and does not jibe with much of the literature, are 14% more likely to use traditional, but has no impact on the likelihood of using any of the other strategies. Leftist organizations are 13% more likely to use violence, 12% less likely to use traditional politics. If there is serious state repression, and this is not a surprise to me, and I'm assuming to many of you, 24% less likely to use traditional politics, 6% less likely to use nonviolent politics, and 26% more likely to use violence. Social service provision, 20% less likely to use traditional politics, and 19% more likely to use violence. Now, that leads us to the next question, which is, once an organization has chosen violence, why are some of them better at it and some of them focusing on certain kinds of violence? And what we're going to be looking at here is a paper that I've done with Brian Phillips, Carl Rethmeyer, Corina Simonelli, which looks at when do insurgent organizations target civilians. Insurgent organizations are defined as insurgent organizations because they are actually targeting soldiers. You need to kill 25 or more soldiers to enter the data set most people use. But why are some of these organizations that are successful at killing soldiers still killing civilians? And from a meta-theoretical perspective, we look at the environmental factors of the organizations, the capabilities of the organizations, the attributes of the organizations, and by capabilities, relationships and attributes, the organizational goals, and we believe these things together come together to help us understand what their behavior is. And let's define the big allied and dangerous data set's definition of terrorism. That's the data set we're using. It's a data set that I created with Carl Rethmeyer. And the fact that the acronym is BAD makes me very happy. And we are defining terrorism as an act of violence, and specifically, and there are lots of definitions, but we are specifically saying terrorism as an act of violence targeting civilians for violence, okay? And we're looking specifically at insurgent organizations in the BAD2 data set. And I'd be happy to talk more about that data set after if people are interested. We're looking at 140 organizations yearly from 1998 to 2012, based on the UCDP criteria of 25 or more battle deaths. There are 102 or 72% of the organizations had at least one fatality in the global terrorism database for at least 1 year. 19 organizations or 13% had 1 to 10 fatalities they inflicted. 14% had 500 or more fatalities. And I've also done analysis on CBRN, if that's of interest to people in the future, where 16% pursued or hoaxed or used CBRN attacks as well. Now, insurgency groups, as we said, a lot fewer than terrorist organizations. They're less likely to be highly linked to each other, more likely to be bigger organizations. It's one of the reasons they're able to actually kill soldiers. So size actually differentiates a lot less than terrorist organization, which have a much wider range of size differentials between them. And we will note that despite some things that people say, not all insurgent groups use terrorism, i.e. target civilians at all, and some do it very rarely. And here we're using a logistic yes or no question. Did they attack or not attack civilians in any particular year? And if they did, it's coded as 1. Otherwise, it's coded as a 0. And we're finding what's having the biggest impact is killing a lot of people on the battlefield. So if I'm already killing a lot of soldiers, I'm more likely to also be killing civilians. Also, if I am an organization that has more alliances, I'm more likely to kill civilians. Interestingly, if an organization is located in a democracy, it is more likely to be killing civilians. Having an important impact, if an organization has territorial control, it's more likely to kill civilians. If the level of government repression is high, it's more likely. And ideologies are having an impact, specifically ethnic ideology and religious ideology are making it more likely, but religious ideology is only one-tailed, meaning the statistical significance is not as strong as ethnic ideology. And there are several factors that we thought would have an impact, but did not. Size was not statistically significant. Leadership was not. Leftist ideology was not. Social service provision was not. Drug trafficking was not. Rivalry and GDP per capita in the country was not. If we look specifically at the percentage impacts, you can see here that it is 65% more likely that an organization is going to be killing civilians if it has a high level of battle deaths in the UCDP. It's 62% more likely to be killing civilians if it has strong alliances with other organizations. If it's in a democracy, it's 48% more likely to be doing that. If it controls territory, 21% more likely. If there is a high level of political terror, meaning the state is being repressive in that country, 24, almost 25% more likely. Ethnic ideology is having a 16% impact. Religious ideology is having a 14% positive impact. But I will note again that that is one-tailed, okay? And so I have tried to do this quickly and hopefully clearly. And Adam, I am ready for questions.
Ooh.
Was that effective, Adam?
Yes, it was very effective, Victor. Thank you very much. I'm just in the process of sending a chat out to everybody, asking them for questions. Do we have any questions, folks? I see one popping up. Does the ill-defined term of terrorism obscure our understanding of terrorism-related studies and reports?
Holy crap, yes. I strongly, Tanguy, I strongly feel that we need to have clear operationalizations of terrorism. There are definitions of terrorism that are everything from violence against governments to, if you're trying to scare people. And that's one of the reasons that we come up with an operationalization of terrorism for this analysis, that we try to make as very clear as possible. For us, terrorism means one specific thing. It is the political targeting of civilians for violence. And that is how we're defining terrorism. But in the terrorism literature, there is a very wide range of what people are saying it is. And that has led people to doing analyses that lead to very different results because they're operationalizing the key dependent variable in very different ways.
Yeah, I have to say, Victor, that one of our biggest challenges running the State Department project is, well, obviously there's parts of the world where open source media is of lesser quality and more confused than other areas. But there are also parts of the world where you have proxies, you have terrorist organizations, you have state actors, quasi-state actors, and it just becomes incredibly messy to try and code and quantify these incidents. And so one of the questions I had for you is, how would we use this kind of approach to develop ideologies for groups to really be able to get a better idea of, motive, understanding, tactics, strategy, etc.
So what we've done with the bad data, and like I said, I'm happy to send papers, is we have been very clear how we're operationalizing the different factors. Some factors we use counts. So for example, we draw from the Global Terrorism Database. The Global Terrorism Database has a very wide definition of terrorism, so we've operationalized it differently. The Global Terrorism Database includes police and security in their coding. So what we've done is we've separated out in their coding the civilian attacks from the security attacks. And I think that would be a strong thing to do. And then for, you were talking about sometimes difficult. So for example, organizational size, you'll get different estimates. And so instead of using a numerical estimate, 10,000 people, what we've done is we've come up with an ordinal variable of, is this below 100? Is it between 100 and 1,000, 1,000 and 5,000, and so forth? And that allows us to get a more accurate, because we're not saying a specific number, which can often be problematic, but saying what level is it at. Okay. And then Ian has a question. Yes, Ian, how terrorism events are understanding of them is how they're reported. And the media does have key disinformation propaganda on these factors in terms of global terrorism. And this is why organizations that collect data on terrorist attacks really need to be looking for more than one article and more than one source to try and identify if an attack has happened. And so I think that's critical. You are always going to have some elements of fuzzy, but the more that you can get validation from different sources, you're going to be moving away from the fuzzy, if that makes sense.
I think it makes sense, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure how you operationalize that. I've been validating a number of incidents in Afghanistan, and we will not use, obviously, the Taliban as a source of information. So you'll have state media who will talk about, an incident where the Taliban attacked a checkpoint and they killed 25 of the Taliban, and none of the state forces were even wounded. So, you start seeing this levels of disinformation, misinformation from, both sides of this. So it makes it challenging.
It is a challenge, but it's an important challenge to do our best to figure this out. I mean, this is one of the reasons why when I do these kind of analyses, you'll note that I presented did they or didn't they, as opposed to how many did they. I've also done analysis on how many did they, but we try and do the analysis in different ways that can get it at different aspects of this. Other questions?
Are there any more questions out there? Come on, folks, don't be shy. This is unusual. Either Victor was very, very clear, or
extremely boring.
There you go, Victor from Owen.
Great. Hold on, let me pull this open. So Owen, what we're doing now, yes, there has been indefinite growth in the spread of right-wing terrorism. One thing that I did consider us doing is I've done work with Josh Bralick and Stephen Shermack on right-wing terrorism in the United States. And I've done work with Andy Vitzik on that. And we just got a grant from DHS to collect data on extremist organizations. One of the key elements is right-wing extremism. And we are looking to see if we can get resources. And one of the key differences between what we're doing and what other people are doing is there are different groups that are focusing on collecting data on incidents, but what we're doing is focusing on collecting data on the organizations themselves, which we find to be very useful in terms of the analytics of the incidents and other kinds of behaviors. And so what I think is going on in terms of right-wing terrorism is we are seeing that waves of different kinds of terrorism over the last 40 or 50 years. And there was a period of time where left-wing terrorism was on an upswing when more countries were right-wing. And I think we're moving in the other direction now with right-wing terrorism being on the upswing when there's been more and more pressure. And it's not just, right-wing is one way of defining it, but a lot of it is what I would call a hyper-nationalist and racist. And this has been an upswing with governments, many governments making a real effort for more inclusion. And some of these organizations are pushing really, really hard against such kinds of inclusion. Okay. Suat is asking, do we see a pattern of reduced targeting of civilians when groups have or seek support from state actors? That really depends, Suat. It depends on what the state actors want. Sometimes when the state actors want more violence, they will encourage these organizations to kill more civilians because they want to make things worse. So it really depends on the different states' support here. And Suat, that is a question that we have not fully analyzed as a paper, but something that we should certainly put on our list. Amy, how did we come up with our definition of terrorism? We came up with our definition of terrorism because when I first started looking at terrorism as a key question to analyze, I wanted to bang my head against the wall. And the reason I wanted to bang my head against the wall was because there were so many definitions and there was no clear coherence. And, how do you draw the line, right? And there are plenty of people who draw the line by saying, if you're the government, if you're a state, you're not committing terrorism. If you're a non-state actor, you're committing terrorism. And I just think that's wrong. Sometimes states are the bad guys and the insurgents are not the bad guys. And sometimes it's the reverse, and sometimes they're both bad guys. But for me, I think one of the things that I would hope that neither states nor insurgents do is target and try and kill civilians. And both states and non-state actors have done that. And that's how we drew the line there in terms of saying, we're going to define this bad behavior, which is what terrorism is basically seen as targeting and killing civilians. And if that doesn't make sense, let me know. So Ian is asking, are the far-right organizations a new breed of far-right ideology or re-energized forms of older, more traditional groups? I think it's a combination of both, but some of the nationalist right-wing movements are definitely basically a resurgence of the KKK and other racist movements in this country. I mean, if you saw some of the flags that were flying, yes. So, but some are new in the way they're thinking about this or totally newly started. And this is one of the things I said in terms of our new grant for focusing on American organizations that we're going to be spending some time taking a look at. Casey is asking the upswing of right-wing groups, do you see learning happening among these groups? Yes. So across all groups, groups do learning in terms of their own behaviors and the impact. But also some groups do put serious effort in trying to learn from other groups in terms of how to do better for themselves, in terms of what you're suggesting, in terms of online resources, fundraising and stuff. One of the things we have not looked at in our research is online activities. And it's one of the things that we would like to get into as well, because I think it is and becoming more and more an important issue. Louise is asking, in our analysis, so one of my co-authors is my colleague, Carl Rethmeyer. Carl is a social network analyst. He's the guy who made the network map behind me. And he is, we have done analysis on the social network side of things. And one of the things that we found consistently is the more connections you have, you are more likely to be powerful, right? So if you, the data behind me is data on terrorist organizations from 1998 to 2005. And you can see, if you can see behind me, that the more connections you have, and again, this is all probabilistic and not deterministic, the more connections you have, the bigger the circles are. These circles are measures of how lethal they are. And so it certainly has had an impact on that. And then Tanguy, you saying controversial question. So Tanguy, I think yes, people can debate the existence of terrorist organizations. But I think if you adopt and explain the operationalization and definition of what you mean by terrorist, then you can operationalize and define whether such an organization exists and which organizations are such organizations. And so, as I said before, there are some insurgent organizations that are definitely also terrorist organizations. And there are some insurgent organizations that really stay away mostly from terrorism. And so people argue about it. But I do think as long as you're being very clear on how you're operationalizing and defining something, I think you can make clear what you're identifying as a terrorist or an insurgent organization.
You have one more there from Owen.
Okay. So Owen, our approach is quantitative and statistic. And so for us, it's about the increase in probabilities, and lethality is impacted by several different components. And size in this particular instance is not having a big effect, but it does have a big effect on other components, but network connections is having a bigger effect, okay? Is it possible to get a clearer look at the network chart? Hold on a second.
I'm assuming that's the one behind you.
Yes, that is the one behind me, and I probably should have included it in the, let me see.
If you want to email it to me, I can send it to Tony if it's available.
No, hold on, let me just give me 1 minute here.
While we're reading, are there any more questions, folks out there?
Any questions?
Yes, there's one more from Owen.
Tell me what the question is while I'm looking this up.
Can you talk about your methods for doing this probabilistic work?
So what we're using several different methods, but the one we're using, basically we're doing quantitative analysis. Some of our analysis is statistical. Some of our they're all statistical. Some of our analysis is using logit, logistic regression, where the dependent variable is one variable of either yes or no. Some of the analysis is, and I'm going to share my screen here. Hold on. And some of the analysis is ordinal logit. So is it a 1, is it a 2, is it a 3 when I categorize certain things? And some of the analysis is count models. So 0, 1, up to 1,000 or 2,000 or whatever. Okay, can people see the map better now? Anthony, is this showing up better? Okay, so you can see the different components here. The red organizations are Islamist, and you can see the size of the circle here is how lethal they are. And you can see that it's not deterministic, but clearly organizations that have more connections are more lethal. Okay, thank you, Anthony.
Victor, I have a quick question for you. I don't see on this map Africa, and one of the challenges that I currently face is trying to distinguish between, yesterday the State Department put 2 more ISIS affiliates on the foreign terrorist organization list, ISIS Mozambique, and ISIS DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo. But there are ethnic groups that, whether it be in the Southern Sudan or in the DRC or elsewhere, who have been tribal ethnic rivalries since the beginning of time. And sometimes they use terror tactics. There's definitely fear. There's definitely loathing. There's often religious undertones and overtones. Have you ever looked at how you distinguish from what I would call terrorism proper versus this kind of ethno-communal violence?
So ethno-communal violence can be terrorism, and it really depends on how you're operationalizing. And the kind of mass atrocities you're talking about fall into how the global terrorism database has coded things, but how other data sets have coded atrocities. I will note one thing about the map that I showed people is that is data from 98 to 2005, and only terrorist organizations, not insurgent organizations. And the new data that we have collected for insurgent organizations does include more African organizations as well.
Excellent. Would it be able to get a copy or the PDF of that, Victor? A couple of people have asked if I could share it with them.
Absolutely. Of what I just, yes.
I'm assuming it's PDF.
Yes, it is a PDF.
Sure.
And
I knew when we were doing the intro, everybody'd be fascinated by that.
Well, I'm glad they're fascinated by it. And I will email it to you, Adam, and I'm more than happy for you to send out to people. And again, if I just emailed it to you, Adam.
Great,
and
thanks.
Again, if anybody has any questions or wants other papers, I'm happy to send. I will also note that if people are interested in the other areas of my research related to discrimination, I'd be more than happy to talk about that as well.
Excellent. Well, we're trying to keep these short and sweet, Victor, because we know your time is precious. We have one more question, and then I think we will have done our work in the allocated 40 minutes. So there's one more there from Suat.
So Suat, the question of does it being powerful and lethal lead to more networks? That's really the right question for that person to ask that question to, is Carl Refmeyer. I believe it does, but I haven't looked at the paper recently. But Carl is the social network analyst expert. Okay, so I don't want to give you the wrong answer there.
Well, maybe we should invite him to do one of these briefings in the future. That would be great. I'd like to thank you very much, Victor, on behalf of the group. That was fascinating, but email chatter and that I have received. I think you really stirred some interest here. So we're always grateful for your time, and it was a great presentation, and we hope to be talking to you soon. I'd also like to thank everybody who tuned in, and we look forward to doing this again. If anybody out there is listening and would like to be part of our speaker series, please just send me an email or send me a note in the chat, and we will organize it and get going.
Sounds good. Thank you, Adam.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Victor. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.